The panel today represents an attempt to fill in some of the gaping holes that exist when we talk about Iran in general and the arts in Iran in particular. It's also sort of a long-term interest of Bidun, the magazine that I co-edit, to think about the present through the past, in a sense. As many of you know, when people speak of the contemporary arts in this part of the world, it's often with a good dose of wonder, as if, and I'm thinking about Iran especially, one has overcome tremendous odds to have an art school or a performance or an exhibition or an art fair. In this way, I think of today's discussion as part two or even a precursor to a discussion we had last year here at the Global Art Forum on independent art spaces in Iran. It aims to answer the question, where did we come from and how did we get here? But in exploring these questions, we have to do so with a dose of modesty, and as such, we're going to limit our discussion today to the 1970s in Iran, the decade preceding the Islamic Revolution of 1979. It was during the latter part of the 1960s and throughout the 1970s that the Iranian state's patronage of the arts grew as one part of its modernization project. And so dams were built, industrial centers were developed, universities were erected, and slowly the arts too were privileged, and perhaps most canonically personified in the figure of Kamran Diba, who was the former empress. In 1967, the former empress launched the Shiraz Arts Festival, a performance arts festival held in the southern town of Shiraz, and it was directed by Reza Ghotbi. There, I mean, some of you have been there, they're sort of the iconic 6th century ruins of Persepolis. You had Merce Cunningham, Stockhausen, John Cage, Ravi Shankar, and many others gather in the desert over the course of 11 years. Xenakis, the Greek sort of experimental composer, may have produced his best works there, including the 1968 work Nuit, which is dedicated to political prisoners. Bob Wilson produced his epic 7-day theatrical production, Ka Mountain and Gardenia Terrace. Peter Brook came to Shiraz as well. And in 1971, with an Iranian-Armenian named Arbi Ovanessian, directed, it was called Orgast, which was a 24-hour play written by Ted Hughes. In a sense, what happened those years in Shiraz was important for multiple reasons. First, there was the context of a country that so generously subsidized the arts. And second, and we tend to use the word avant-garde in a very casual way, but the performances held in Shiraz were, I think, important anywhere in the world, much less Iran at that time and even today. There's little doubt that these performances inspired a generation of Iranian artists, and I'm thinking of the composer Daryush Dolatshahi, Bijan Mofid, the theater director. About Shiraz, the historian William Shawcross has said this, quote, "By the mid-70s, this had become one of the most controversial cultural events in the country. Sometimes the empress's enthusiasms seemed to jar. Although she was determined to preserve Iran's past, her contemporary tastes were often too avant-garde, too cosmopolitan for most of her countrymen." So we could speak later about what it means to be too avant-garde. But there was more than Shiraz in its arts festival. There was a small gallery scene. There was at least one recognizable artistic movement known as the Sakakhane School, which its primary protagonists were people like Zenderudi and Tanavoli, many of whom you know. And there were a number of artist-run spaces, such as one that Mr. Diba ran called Rasht 29. There were also arts publications. A number of them included Tamasha, which was produced by the state television. There was Khurus Jangi. There was another one devoted to arts and architecture. And then a plan came about to build a museum, and which will be a focal point of our talk today. Eventually, as the museum's collection grew, the Iranian state became one of the most formidable collectors of modern art anywhere in the world. And then we had a revolution in 1979, and the rest is sort of history. The museum's collection is, of course, the subject of many intrigues, and most recently the subject of at least one very good documentary film by Bahman Kiarostami, which was shown at MoMA last week, 2 weeks ago, and I recommend. So I'm going to introduce our panelists. We have Fereydoun. He was educated in the United States and returned to Iran to be the artistic director of the Zand Gallery and designer of the Iran-America Society. Later, he went on to open at least 2 independent art spaces while also pursuing his own artwork. In Dubai, he's worked a great deal as an independent curator and continues to live between here, Tehran, and Paris. Kamran Diba is here too, to my far right. He's trained as an architect, and he was the first director, the founding director of the Tehran Museum of Contemporary Art, as well as the building's designer. Together with the former empress, he was largely responsible for building up what would become one of the most legendary collections of modern art anywhere in the world. I should also add that he's an artist. We're sad not to have Tony Shafrazi, but anyone who knows Tony knows that it's quite good that he's not here because he's a sort of monologuer. But Tony was active in and around what you could refer to as the New York School as an artist and also as a dealer. He also came to Iran, where he was born, in the late 1970s to open a gallery, which unluckily opened on the eve of the revolution. So we miss Tony, but we've got two distinguished panelists here. I'm going to start. We have probably 15, 20 minutes. So we'll go straight into it. I'm going to start with Fereydoun, who came back to Iran in 1970, and ask you what was the world that you sort of discovered when you came back to Iran? What was Iran like in 1970, and specifically in the cultural realm?
Okay. Mine is just one of 30 million stories. It's not history, it's just my story, okay? So I'm not a historian, I'm fuzzy with dates, I'm fuzzy with names, but the spirit I capture. I came back to Iran in exactly 1970, trained as a applied arts of the theater specialist and a special year in cinema at NYU. So my main interest was actually in the theater and the performing arts. And at the time, the only place that existed was the cultural center of the Iran-America Society, which was this fabulous building done by Frank Lloyd Wright for Baghdad, never built there, transported to Iran, and made into the only viable, actually designed space, which had 2 galleries, 2 theaters, conference centers, everything that one could ask for. So obviously I went to work with them. Also, my Iranian needed a little practice, so I started in a bilingual space. We programmed, everybody came there because it really was the only cultural center. That's really important. But the whole spirit of the time was a lot of people like myself coming back and having good intentions. But as we all know, the way to hell is paved with good intentions. Okay. But there was a spirit of we want to build, we want to help, we want to make a difference, and okay, whichever way it went, but that's what the spirit was. The Shiraz Arts Festival was in its like 3rd or 4th year, and it had a lot of critics, but at the time, I wrote an article, somebody had criticized it, that is this what Iran needs? That wasn't the point. It's what the world needed at the time. You can't be so territorial in the sense that we're just doing what Iran needs. Iran is part of the world, and which I hope it will become again. And so what was good for the world would eventually be good for Iran. And everything that happened at the time was actually the foundation of everything you see now. It's not a mushroom growth thing where all of a sudden there was lightning and the contemporary Iranian scene grew up after the revolution. No way. Perfect proof is this gentleman sitting next to me who witnessed and nurtured and did all the things that were necessary to develop that whole thing. Kiarostami, who everybody thinks is like a post-revolutionary filmmaker, he was trained at the Empress's Institute, the Qanun. What else? I've lost track. What do you want me to say?
Well, I'm going to come back to you.
Okay, finish.
Yeah, we have time. We have no time. But we'll, and Kamran, I'm going to ask you two questions in one. What was the sort of Iran that you inherited when you went abroad and came back? And why did you think a museum?
Say that again.
So what did you find when you studied abroad, you came back? What did you know, maybe you can tell us a few words about Rash, the artist space that you opened.
When I came back to Iran, I wanted to overthrow the system. And we were frustrated because everybody was there doing their things and we were young and restless. Yeah? Yeah?
Yeah.
Better. So it was a very small art community, few galleries, few artists. We were getting together. Nobody respected us as artists, and everybody thought we were crazy, and we had long hairs. So we made a club. We called it Rash 29, which was located on the street of Rash, and the number was 29. And we thought it's a good idea. We could get together and encourage each other. And funny enough, this club became kind of an art powerhouse. And those days, you know, hippies used to come from Europe and America, going to Kathmandu to become saint. And they stopped by in our club, and they played music, and sometimes we smoked with them. So that was the scene. And then we were very snobbish. People from the, let's say, fancy areas, they wanted to come to our club, but we had a bouncer, and we told them that anybody coming here with a Mercedes-Benz or something fancy, don't let them in, you know. And we issued cards for the artists and said, this is your club. A lot of poets and a lot of filmmakers and writers and the press, you know, they used to hang around this place. Okay, this was basically the scene, you know. And then I had this opportunity with the Queen, you know. We decided to make this museum. The museum, of course, was just an idea, and it was a one-man operation, and he said, take this. I said, she said, how much is it going to cost to make a plan of museum? I said, just give me $5,000 and, you know, I'll make a plan. And this, with $5,000, you know, I made a plan in with a program. And I modeled the museum after the MoMA, Museum of Modern Art, that I knew from my student days. Of course, you know, I had a lot of background. These are some of the images of the museum that you see, which has been sent to me after the revolution. That means they really looking after this building and appreciate it. So I made a program with different departments: design, architecture, photography, works on paper, posters, paintings, of course, and sculptures. And then in the mid-70s, before the museum opened, because at the beginning it was a paper project and I was carrying it around for 9 years to find the money to build it. This was not a government project, and of course the Queen didn't want to pay for the museum from her pocket, and then, or maybe she didn't have enough money to pay for it, so so this thing dragged down for 9 years, you know, till we did it eventually with the help from the government. So I'm going to go to the collection building. About the collection building. Okay. In the mid-70s, we were lucky. We had an exceptional time. You may not go that fast, you know, because you could give me a few minutes. And then this shows some of the highlights and of this collection, which starts with the Impressionists.
Just one thing I wanted to add is, when we first spoke, you said that the Empress had a sort of emphasis or instinct to collect Impressionism.
But and well, I tell you the concept, you see. I had, since I programmed the museum from the beginning, and this was the first museum which was called Museum of Contemporary Art. Because in those days, there were modern art museums, which they showed 20th century collections. And, but I wanted really, you know, from the beginning, I thought that Since I was familiar with big collections of Impressionists in America, in Philadelphia, in the East Coast, and in Phillips' collection, which was they had a lot of Impressionists, I knew very well that the good work of the Impressionists already there in the States and they're in museums. So I know it's totally useless, we go and make a collection of Impressionists. But of course, we lived in a very conservative society, and they didn't want to go far beyond, of Impressionist pretty, sceneries. We could move on a little bit, and then the art which was recognizable. So in a sense, I had to, when I took the directorship of the museum, then I put more time and emphasis to make the museum up to date. I tell you what was my concept of the museum. My concept of the museum was a place that we have the art of the time, because at that time Iran was striving to become a modern society. And we were importing all the junk from the West, we were importing all the technology, machinery, industrial product, consumer goods, but why not art? And I thought that I should make a window and show the art of the West, because we want to be the first world. We don't want to stay third world in art and be first world in technology. So as a result, this museum meant to be a window to the Western world. My second idea was that to make the Western art available to general public. This collection at the beginning, people called it the collection of the Shah. At one point, they boycotted the museum, and some of the leftist artists in the West didn't want to sell any work to us. But I had to fight against that. But my idea was that, and from the beginning, this idea was nobody's private collection. This is supposed to be a public collection from the beginning. So, of course, you see the Pollock that everybody envied, even European artists, and we happened to buy it at an expensive price in those days. The second concept and idea was to create the interaction between the Iranian contemporary artists and some Western artists. I felt that, by bringing the Western art, putting it side by the local art, this gives a lot of confidence to the local artists, and at the same time, Iranians, they would think that, why not us? We probably as good, or we could do even better. So that was the idea of creating interaction. And then, of course, in those days, it was not like today. You didn't have internet, you didn't have big libraries everywhere. You didn't travel that easy. So I thought also this could be a window to the Western culture in Iran, and people could walk in the museum. So they could walk in a museum anywhere in Europe or in America. So these were overriding concepts of making that collection. So I felt there could be an interaction between Iranian contemporary art and the Western contemporary art. So that's why the emphasis of that period, which I try to complete and fill the holes of the collection. You have any question, Nagar? Any more?
Tell us a little bit about the Iranian collection.
Yeah, let's see. You see, if you go, I say next, then you move. These are some of the Iranian collection of the museum, because museum had two parallel collections. One was Iranian artists and the other one was Western artists. And this was the first attempt to put a serious collection of local art together. Because now, I went to see Dr. Farjam's collection, which is as good as the museum collection when it comes to Iranian art. And I regretted the museum authorities, they did not go on to complete and buy, They just let all these work slip out of the country, and tomorrow they have to pay a high price to bring it back. That's what exactly the Queen did, He had to pay a very high price to buy some of the older manuscripts of Iranian art and then return it to Iran. So we go on. So these are some of the artists of the time. You just let's move on. And then you see the figuration and in a different way. And these artists were not interacting together because some of them, they were educated in Italy, some of them in Iran, some of them in US, some of them in Germany. So it was the art scene was quite diverse, and they had different influences. Could we go on? So you see, we have calligraphy, we have all these artists, which I'm not going to name the artist, which is irrelevant. And okay, this is yours truly here, you know, in '61, and then we go in the collection of the museum. So these are the artists now. Now, when I finish that, I would show you also. We go Lashahi. You know that in the old days he was somehow a little bit modern calligraphy. But I would say that there are many valid artists which are not here. I'm not showing because we had to make it very short. And this is also my personal work, pop art and whatever, which I did later. So we go to the end. Now I'm going to see the chronology of the same collection. So you see who did what first, because there is a lot of fight among Iranians that I was the first one, you know, and so on. But we have two distinct schools of art in Iran. One was Saqakhane, which I mean we could, and the other one was calligraphy. And among the calligraphy, we had two different, let's say, two different movements. Abstract calligraphy and then legible and readable calligraphy, which was this is a example of abstract calligraphy, and this is the chronology, correct? Yeah, okay. And this is you see the chronology there. And you see Zenderudi went to making the calligraphy much later period. There's a Pilaram also, you know, in the calligraphy in a different way. So we are moving backward to the past, I suppose. You know, this is also famous artist Yektai, who always lived in New York. Daryabagi, and then again the calligraphy school, which I have the dates there. I don't know if you could read it or not. And this is the figuration. And then you see this is goes back. I cannot read the dates from here. No.
75.
And yeah, and this is a pop art was shown in his gallery. Is my one work.
Okay, I think I'll transition. I read that quote in the beginning, in the introduction, about sort of the perception that what was happening in Iran in the arts was too avant-garde or too Western or too indulgent or too irrelevant, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, Khomeini sort of famously dismissed the activities of Shiraz in 1977, I think. But I just want to come back to Fereydoun and ask him, what does
maybe
that mean?
make a correction here. I think it had nothing to do. The last year of the Shiraz Festival, the regime felt that this is not appropriate to stage it. And because they folded it themselves, because they politically created some avant-garde. You know, the problem was that the people of the festival, art festival, they did not like the idea of censorship. And then the caliber of the artists was that if you told them that you cannot perform that, they would have not performed at all. So what happened, you know, there was a backlash from the community of Shiraz because they thought that some of the artistic expressions were not moralistic or whatever, acceptable to their norms, and actually the governor of the Shah, you know, somehow winded down the whole operation.
So there was a recognition that it was, but I'd spoken to Fereydoun quite a bit about this, about, you know, it did go on for 11 years and it did leave some sort of legacy, and a lot of us know the contemporary Iranian sort of art world, and I wonder if you can connect the dots and tell us, you know, was there a local audience, were Iranian students engaged, artists, et cetera, and how do we see its legacy today?
Yeah, absolutely. What's really important is something Kamran Diba said. It was the only island in Iran that there was absolutely no censorship. And that was part of, it was written into the whole institution, that that's how this art festival would be. Now, every single student was given special tickets, special discounts, special everything so they could all attend. And they did. So much of what you see today, the seeds were sown then. It was the crossroads of everybody coming through, and part of the job description for people who came through and did group things was to work with Iranians. A point that I can easily get to is Peter Brook, his Orgas production that Mahine Tajaddud, who did part of the writing with Ted Hughes, and Arbio Venetian, who helped with the directing with Peter Brook. And they used, half the cast was Iranian. And that's just one example of what happened. And every production, well, almost every production, that could then come from Shiraz to Tehran was brought to Tehran and shown. For me, when a country we were in the petrodollar phase, okay? There were superfluous funds. It is the duty of every country that has that sort of superfluous fund to champion the avant-garde, to non-commercial. Okay, forget avant-garde, non-commercial, because nobody else is going to do it. Only the people with the money can afford to do that. That's why it was so important, and that's why it affected everybody that came and saw, and you see the results now. It didn't just come from nowhere. Even if these people are under 30, their teachers were the ones who attended the Shiraz Arts Festival.
Could I say, you know, Tony is not here, and then I just want to clarify the issue. Maybe he didn't want to confront me, you know, he found an excuse not to come.
Uh-oh.
The thing is, you know, Tony has claimed that he was our advisor, you know, and he has repeated that in the press to an extent that, you know, even the Queen has believed him, and mentioned his name as an advisory board to the museum. The fact of the matter is that, you know, Tony Shafrazi, actually, he introduced me to Tony. Tony came to Iran to make a project for art festival. His project was a film and was rejected. Then he was desperate what to do. He came to him and he called me and said, come, and this is a nice guy, try to help him. Of course, we knew that he tried to destroy Guernica in the Museum of Modern Art and start spraying on the most famous artwork of the world. About a couple of years before, we should have been stupid or out of our mind to appoint a guy with such a background as an advisor to make a collection of the museum. He's a good friend, but he's little... And then something else happened. I recently read this very interesting. I recently read in Leo Castelli's story, which comes from the mouth of Tony. Tony said that I went to Leo and I had a spray can hidden in my jacket, and it was the exhibit of Jasper Johns. And then I looked around and Leo came, you know, of course people were a little nervous about him. He walked in the gallery. Of course, Leo was not standing in the gallery floor, but he came out, you know, to make sure what he's up to. He said, I told Leo, I'm going to spray 5 words on 5 different paintings. Those days, Jasper Johns was the most expensive artist in the world. And this is from Tony's mouth. What he did is, Leo said that, Tony, you're a fantastic guy, let's take a ride, you know, called a cab, and with Tony, they went to the river and had a half an hour walk. And Tony never realized that, you know, Leo Castelli, in his right mind, wanted to get him as far away as the gallery as possible. So it's very ironical that one day he called me, Castelli, and said, do you mind this boy bring you some transparencies of the work that you were looking for? I said, no, I don't mind. If you could help him and give him a little commission, you know, it'll be more than glad. But in fact, Tony was never hired by us never saw the Queen, never advised in any committee. He was just a little freelance dealer trying to make a little fast buck, you know, between the galleries and us. And he's a nice guy, but this thing has got away with him, and he really believes that he was our advisor, and we bought everything.
I think he's just told the story so many times that it becomes true. But he also gave a talk on conceptual art at the Iran American
memory's
Society.
a funny
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
Okay, Kamran, I do have to correct just one thing. He did meet the Queen. He took some pictures of her and he did some silk screens. But okay, that came right at the end. But everything Kamran says is true.
Not as an advisor, as
No,
someone
no,
to
no,
take
no,
her-
no, no, as an artist, of course. When he came to me, I was programming at the Iran American Society. Why are we talking about Tony? Okay, we're talking about Tony. He came to the Iran American Society saying, I want to give a talk. Now, I didn't know this thing about the presenting of the film and having failed and not accepted and so forth, so on. And I said, okay, let's have your talk. He did a talk. Nobody quite understood what the talk was about. And then he came to me once I was art director of the Zand Gallery and said, I want to be an artist. I said, okay, but you are an artist, yes. And he was doing a book called Magumbo, which was a photo roman type story which he photographed. In Italy, it was mainly made. And then he wanted to do cutouts. We actually gave him one exhibition. I probably have the largest collection of Tony Shafrazis in my drawers in the world. That's... Any more about Tony?
He wanted
no.
to Skype in, but we said no. Might be
I think we don't badmouth him anymore.
Arslan, how are we doing on time? Because it's after 4:30. We're going to just keep on going.
I think nobody's kicking us out.
I might ask some more questions, but if anyone has a burning question, it seems like a good opportunity to... the conceptual... I mentioned Tony did a talk on conceptual art. Yeah, no. But, I mean, it's one thing that comes to mind really immediately is that we talk about a country with petrodollars and its potential to do something significant in the arts. And we're sitting in Dubai, Abu Dhabi is next door, and, you know, sort of case in point. And the first time I met Tony was, I guess, 3 years ago in Abu Dhabi. And he said exactly the same thing that happened in Iran in the 70s is in fact happening in Abu Dhabi. And of course, countries brand themselves through culture, but there's also, you know, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I wonder if you two, I mean, especially Fereydoun, you live here part of the time. Do you see parallels between the Iranian case and what's happening here? And what can we learn from that case as we're trying to figure out, you know, what is the future collection of the Guggenheim going to be like? What is...
Yeah, I do see parallels. We did our own homegrown museum, so there isn't that parallel. But the same, okay, there was, one tends to try to do everything in a short time, and there are no shortcuts, okay? It all has to happen, and at a certain, the way it grows is the way it grows, and it's organic. If it's not growing, then it ain't organic. If it's transplanted, it takes a while to take root. Yeah, I do see similarities, and I think what's important is for everybody to look at Iran at that time and learn stuff. I'm not going to teach stuff. All I'm saying is just take a look at Iran at that time.
Come on, do you also see it as kind of similar, what's happening here and what happened?
Well, I think the scale, you know, first of all, you know, it's about even half a century, you know, later, what's happening here. And the game has changed, you know. One thing it was important to say that when we were purchasing art, there weren't many galleries, there weren't many artists, and there was no such a thing as art crowd that you see today. So art was very elitist, and the intellectuals and art lovers, a very limited segment of the population. And there was no such a thing as a secondary market that you see nowadays. Nobody speculated on art, and usually the art which was available was the art you buy from the gallery walls. When I went to Leo Castelli to buy art, I was very disappointed. He didn't have any art of the past, like even the past shows of the artists that he cared. Even, I went to, had a breakfast with Andy Warhol, went to his factory, he called his studio factory, and he never offered anything to me to buy. He loved money. He was trying to make portraits of celebrity and all the people, but he never offered any secondary market. All the things, wonderful things that we see, if you go through the auction houses catalog of last 4 years, you see such a wealth of material being dumped on the market. I don't know where these things came, even from the past. Those days was very difficult. So it's much easier now with the money from Abu Dhabi to make a collection. We are painful. I wanted to have a comic strip era of Liechtenstein, and I had to call half a dozen dealers, ask everybody to look around and find such, and it was very difficult because those days, usually art came to the market because of death, bankruptcy, or divorce. So, well, not everybody every day gets bankrupt, and well, the divorces were quite rare, and then though there was no secondary market. And this is much easier to make a big collection, and also Abu Dhabi has the backing of Guggenheim. We had a committee that we had actually Tom Messer, which headed the Guggenheim at those days as on our kind of advisory board, not to purchase art, but just to get some, let's say, transfer of know-how from one museum to another museum. So I had this relationship with Dusseldorf's Schmalenbach, with De Wilde of Amsterdam, and so forth. But also this marriage of Abu Dhabi with Guggenheim, I find it makes it a powerhouse. The money behind the big organization is much easier. I had to learn on the job, but these guys, start at the top. What was happening that it was, we had a bigger artistic community than what is in Abu Dhabi. So it was, in a sense, my idea of creating interaction was much easier between the local art and the international art. But Abu Dhabi has to develop an artistic community of its own eventually, which hopefully they will do, and they're on the road to do that, but it takes a little time. But you don't make a collection, as Fereydoun said, in a museum in 5 years. We worked 3 years, I was in an advisory position in the Tehran Museum, and last 2 years I was the director, actually, meaning I was signing the check. And I'm purchasing, dealing the artists, keeping records. During my time in the museum, we have all the perfect records. We know what we paid and how much. And you will be surprised that I did not spend more than $4.5 million US to acquire a lot of art, And it was. And people said that this Iranian is destroying the art market. When I paid $100,000 for one painting, they said that these Iranian rich people are destroying the art market. They creating inflation. Now look at the prices now. What I bought for maybe 100 now is 60 million. This is the proportion has changed, and that's the difference. And the time has changed.
I should add, for those of you who don't know, the museum was open in the end for about 1 year. So it took about 9 years of planning.
Was it?
So 1977 it opened.
77 opened, and it just carried on, till the revolution, which was right. 79. But it lost steam because even people called me. My board of directors at one point, they called me because it became very fashionable. In all institutions, we had mini revolution. Before we had a larger revolution which got rid of the regime, but we had little revolution that which got rid of all the managers and directors and the bosses. So my board of directors got together and they said that you were a dictator because you didn't consult any committee and you bought all this garbage. And I said that, look, no, this is my responsibility, and the time will tell you that if I bought right or I bought wrong. But you guys, you know, they were not in a position. If I bring a Cy Twombly painting, which is a scribbles, and you're going to say that my child could do that, you're not going to sign a check for $100,000 for it, but I will sign a check any time for a Cy Twombly because I know he's a good artist, but you don't know him. So that was the situation. But you know, Abu Dhabi doesn't have to go through that experience because already has this Guggenheim Museum behind, so they put a stamp of approval in whatever they do, and they're unsafe. You know, it's their insurance policy.
Thanks.